Hi, today we'll be talking about planning, choosing technologies, and building web applications accordingly for appropriate situations. A lot of people will build a website and they'll think that the way they did it is the only way to do it, and the only way that it's done out in the industry, which is incorrect because the way you have to develop websites depends on the environment and the requirements. And based on the environment and the requirements, a different approach is often taken in order to compensate for certain constraints or conditions. Some things that might change the way you would approach building a website is whether it's enterprise web application. This is because the application that you're building out will be communicating with a lot of other systems and processes. Um, Another thing that might change the way and the considerations that you have to take when building out a website is how long a user will be staying on your website and using different functionalities of it, and how much they'll be interacting with the website. Another thing that might change the way you will have to build out your website is the number of concurrent users, whether a user will visit and leave. This goes back to whether it's a long-term usage website or whether they'll just come, get a bit of information and go away. Whether it's a data-driven website where they'll be inputting a lot of information that you will process on the back end of your servers. How heavily you'll be doing processing with the data that you receive, or data from user interactions with your website, or whether it's a highly graphical website. All these factors and more will change the way you approach building out a website and the problems you will encounter after that website has been built out. So here are a couple of things you should consider when you're embarking on a project for a customer. The infrastructure that they provide for you, or the infrastructure you will be using, like the cloud or whatever else, in the case that you have the choice of choosing the infrastructure. The amount of inter-system communications and the amount of systems your application will be communicating with, whether there will be spikes in traffic. For example, if you're an e-commerce store that gets more traffic during Christmas time, your servers will have to compensate for that and be able to handle that large increase during that time, while at other times of the years, it won't have to deal with that. The budget and time, the more budget you have, the more flexibility you have with regards to how much of the details you take care of, as well as the time. They go hand in hand because increased budget means you could have more manpower and quality manpower, which makes a difference. And time means how much you can check your system and compensate for the little details, which will have a big impact later on. Related to budget, another factor you have to consider is the developer power and skills, which is related to budget and time. Because even if you have the ability to hire a lot of people, whether they have the skill set to do what you need to do may be difficult to find. So if your budget's higher, you could train them in those skills, but ideally you'd want someone well trained as well as experienced. So they'll be aware of a lot of the issues that you may encounter and be able to compensate it if they and fix it quickly if it does arrive, because problems cost a lot of money for customers, especially if it's a money generating or critical process support process that has a big financial impact on the company. Another thing you need to consider is the size of the business, whether it's a small business or a big business, because that'll also affect how you should build out the web application. Because for smaller businesses, they might ask for requirements that compensate for what a big business would need. However, it's not always necessary because number one, they usually don't have the budget to hire that manpower. And number two, if you do a quick solution, it could start giving them benefits within their budget and time limits more quickly. Security requirements. Sometimes security takes enforcing security requirements for that web application and access to it could complicate processes. So by skimping on those details, if it's not a secure process or certain things aren't as necessary to take care of, you can actually speed up how fast you can build out that application by taking a couple of shortcuts. The technology skill set sustainability. So while a technology might be popular now, it might not be popular in the future. So you have to ask yourself whether what you have to think carefully about what you're going to build out this application with, and whether you'll be able to have new hires that will be knowledgeable in that, and whether you'll be able to train them and they'll be experienced in all these other factors that you find important for building out your application. Furthermore, the reality is with regards to technology, you're going to have to continuously keep on learning. So that's another thing to factor in. Intranet bandwidth. So we have the internet, which is when we communicate with computers that are not around us, but oftentimes companies set up networks within their companies, which are smaller networks, and they have limited and often a limited amount of information that could be sent at a particular time from these computers communicating with each other. So based on that, you have to build your solution around that, because there will be a lot of applications communicating at a time, and you want them all to function smoothly. And internet providers bandwidth. If this application is being accessed from outside, you might have to, and you get charged for that, you might want to minimize the amount of data that you send to client computers, and that will change based on the situation. Okay, so now that you've thought of that, here are some technologies to consider: WordPress and pre-filled configurable frameworks. The issue with these is that it actually complicates complex graphical websites. Sometimes people place too much emphasis on the graphics and want some fancy animations that actually complicate building out of the website. It makes it harder. So if this is the case and it's more of they want to take it beyond something like Amazon or beyond Groupon, something much more harder to build out, this can be actually time consuming. And in that case, if the graphics are all built from scratch on your side and you need to, it's like a gaming site or something, you might want to build it from scratch rather than use these frameworks. And even building out additional functionality within the constraints of these pre-built frameworks, popular frameworks like WordPress, can actually incrementally increase in time. Although once it's built out, you can reuse that functionality. And sometimes if the website is simple and the functionality exists with plugins to it out of the box and you don't have to do much coding, and the traffic to the site isn't that much, I suggest you do go with WordPress, because number one, you'll be able to get the project done quickly, and number two, paying that little bit of extra will save you a lot of time. However, this goes to our next subject, is that these pre-built configurable frameworks are often totally server-side, and what that means is that the computer sending the website to people that are visiting is doing all the processing. And as a result, what this means is that it will have limits. So the more people that are hitting that computer, the slower that website will become. And if you're going to generate a lot of money with your website, you have to realize that using a totally server-side website that handles everything is not going to be to your advantage. It's going to hurt you over time, and because you pay for network traffic as well as processing power in a lot of sites, and you'd want to, especially when it becomes higher demand. This sort of solution might long term cost you a lot more than it's worth. So this is when we would go to front end frameworks. Of course, applications and pre-built frameworks like WordPress are starting to integrate them, but it hasn't been fully integrated yet. So this is why, because the computer hosting the website, it wasn't able to handle high amounts of users and processing, it got expensive. These front end frameworks were created like Angular, React, and jQuery. The purpose of these frameworks was to put off a lot of the processing and rendering of the website onto the computer browser of the person viewing the website. As a result, what this will do is minimize unnecessary communication between the browser and the server sending out the website, and consequently, it will do less processing of data on the back end, which is the server side, and it will offset that to the front end framework. And as a result, it'll free up not only the intranet network, but also reduce processing power, the amount of processing done on servers, the amount of energy consumed by those servers, free up a lot of the bandwidth within the intranet as well as the internet. So that will be less charges for highly used websites and enterprise frameworks. So this is why they came around. So all complex graphical animations or even information between pages could be passed from one page to another in the browser itself, rather than needing to make a call back to the computer you're hosting the website on. Another thing to consider is CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, Zurb Foundation, and Materialize. What these are for is for designing the layout and the graphical look of your website. These days, with the release of mobile application and tablet PCs and laptops and computers, there are a lot of different monitor sizes to compensate for. In fact, there are more mobile phones in use now than there are laptops, and consequently, you need your website, if it is widely used and you want people to view it from all types of hardware, you need to make it so that it's able to resize automatically and still provide easy to view and pleasing graphical interface. Because the more easy to use your website is on all devices, the more likely they are to come back and use that website more later on. So what these frameworks do, like Bootstrap, Zurb Foundation, Materialize, is allow your website to be resizable and pleasantly viewable without you having to code all that stuff out. So it automatically gives you some elements to use for building out your website and allow it to be resizable or responsive on different things. And furthermore, you don't have to build out from scratch commonly utilized website components. So you can Google more about that if you're interested. Now we go to the backend. There are a lot of different backend technologies that are, and while we won't be getting into this, I will mention a few: REST, .NET, MVC, or even MVC frameworks, which exist in almost every language these days, web language, Python and Java, etc. What these do, these are the languages and the frameworks that run on the computer hosting the website or web application, or even applications in many cases. Based on the backend technology you choose, it might be easier to integrate it with other systems, work in teams in building out your website, or it might be better at machine learning and have different benefits. So understanding these benefits and using the appropriate technology for what you're trying to build out is often useful. However, what I've found is that most people out of school uh, didn't learn how to build websites in school or properly use these frameworks and all the functionality. So what ends up happening, regardless of what you choose, is that they'll build it out, the functionality from scratch, whether they're a software engineer or a computer science major or whatever. So unless they're a specialist, they won't be aware of what already exists, and consequently, you're likely to encounter a lot of solutions where they build these things from scratch. So because they're not aware of the deeper functionality and already built functionality en masse, all these different backend frameworks tend to present themselves when explained as equals, even though they aren't always. Another thing you should consider is system integration technologies. While using a REST development pattern for your website will offer endpoints that could be easily integrated, system integration technologies also allow your application to communicate with other applications while minimizing the amount of coding and complexity to it. Furthermore, the language that you do choose with regards to front-end technologies and back-end technologies tend to vary in speed based on the version. So if you want to reduce the processing power and the amount of computations and amount of heavy work your servers have to do, by choosing an appropriate language and coding it well, it could actually significantly reduce it. However, very rarely do I see people take an appropriate clean coding approach for these factors. So I think it's of minimal importance, especially when you're getting started off, predominantly because having the actual product in the field will tell you whether it's a seller or not, and you really don't know it till you start getting feedback from the clients and what they want changed or not. Reporting technologies. Building out a report, especially a complex report that provides useful information, can be very code intensive if you build it out from scratch. So there are technologies out there that allow you to more quickly and rapidly build out these reports and provide surrounding infrastructure in order to supply people with the information and the type of files or data they need from these reports rather than you having to build it out and provide it for them. So you can integrate these into your websites in order to speed up the creation of these reports and exporting of that information and manipulating of that information will already be built into those reports without you having to do it, as well as methods to reduce the amount of work your server has to use. Popular reporting technologies are SSRS, or SQL Server Reporting Services, a solution provided by Microsoft that was popular in the past, which was more recently replaced by Power BI Reporting Server, which is the predecessor to SSRS, Pentaho, and Chart.js, as well as a plethora of others. But those were what was common in my experience, what I've seen in the industry so far. And there are others. Load handling technologies. So whether you need to cache and methods, because there's going to be a lot of users using your website. If this is the case, if there aren't as many, you don't have to worry about this. But oftentimes when you do have many users trying to access your website, you need to distribute. You have to have more than one computer presenting that website to any one visitor. That way, each of the computers could do the processing and pass back information without slowing it down for everybody. So in this case, methods outside of the actual physical hardware that are used in order to reduce the amount of computing load is things like caching, where it temporarily stores the information that is commonly accessed in memory, and then whenever a call is made for that information, it passes it back to the user rather than making calls to the database or performing those computations again and again. load balancers and database clusters, and more. Another thing you should consider is the database technology and whether you're going to make a heavily um, database driven website or you're going to do a code first approach. There are benefits to both, but in reality is if you don't have a database administrator and developers that are familiar with the functionality offered outside of the box for these databases, just like anything, you're going to end up rebuilding the solution. And I see that again and again with regards to not just the front end frameworks or the back end technologies or the integration technologies or the reporting technologies, but any technology. Because people learn how to code, they don't learn how to use these frameworks that are in existence. They'll self learn it and there'll be things that they aren't aware of that exist. So some database technologies that are widely popular are Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, and PostgreSQL. And these database servers also have different versions of them. Some are have an engine behind the scenes that makes it better at handling high loads. Some are made for free. And there are differences. Put simply. Okay, so like I mentioned in the past, there are the popularity of different languages changes over the years. As you can see in 2009, jQuery was the most popular language up until around 2015. Then it started to decline in popularity as other front-end frameworks increased in popularity. Recently, React.js has surpassed the other technologies, but up until recently, Angular, up until 2019, Angular was winning, and then that declined rapidly. And then Vue.js is growing in popularity as well. But what I found is that with regards to front-end technologies, jQuery was the most popular until recently, and it held the market. These new front-end technologies are a hit or miss because you don't know which one's going to take off or not. So you might go into detail into learning one front-end technology, and then you'll realize like a year later, no one's using it anymore and they're replacing it. For example, back in 2000, I think it was 2013, I was coding websites in Knockout.js. That hasn't even made the list, but and at the time, that was actually the most popular framework with regards to what people were hiring for and more. So front-end frameworks are a bad thing, in my opinion, to specialize in. But at the same time, it is worth learning React and Angular because it seems like they're going to be taking off in the future, and they do reduce the amount of load on the servers as well as on by distributing the load to the browsing computers and doing computations there rather on the back end. So it seems to be the way things are moving now, but technology is really moves in ways. Okay, so now there are scenarios that you have to think of when you are building out a website. So look at this little comic on the right hand side, and I thought this was a cute little comment describing the actual brainstorming of scenarios. Our new models outline a few possible scenarios, the girl saying as she describes the model to the person that's listening. Number 1 is the best case scenario, says the other guy. Scenario 2 is not so great. Scenario 3 would be pretty bad. Then there's scenario 4. We think it's a graphing error. If not, we definitely want to avoid it. So when you're building out a website, there will be a lot of customer service requirements long term. You have to determine what the customer needs. So like, are they going to need support after the website's built out? Are there long-term support requirements? The ease of hiring quality new hires. If that is, could you take bootcamp graduates or college university graduates, self-taught developers, teenagers, etc.? Could you afford to do that? Because oftentimes when people are learning, they might actually introduce errors. However, that's not always the case. Even with experienced developers, the same thing tends to happen. I've seen an improvement in people defending their errors and justifying them, but I've never seen people that are totally error free. Mistakes happen. Are you going to maintain the site alone, or are you going to have a team? Will the site generate long-term revenue or a service? And will you need a mobile app to interact with the site? These are all things you should consider and these scenarios you should take in consideration as you are getting the price and stuff for it, because they might give you, if given the room, people will give you unreasonable requirements for um, for something without understanding the full scope of it. And sometimes, in my opinion, don't do it if it's not going to pay off and there's too much work. I've actually built websites for small customers that didn't pay much. So it would be like $100 for a website, and then they were so demanding with regards to support in the aftermath, even after it was built out, because they needed additional functionality and stuff, and they'd want it for free, right? But it wasn't paying the bills, nor was it putting food on the table. It was more of I'm doing something nice, but at the very least, you get to learn from that, right? But if this is a bigger project where they're going to need long-term support, you're going to have to consider having a budget for that, and hopefully offsetting it, because one man cannot handle support alone, especially when there are spikes. It'll be too stressful, or one woman, right? Furthermore, if you are going to have to hire people for your design, you have to consider the ease of hiring and the quality of the new hires that you need. So if you're going to maintain the site alone, you probably want to use something like WordPress or another tool that already does it for you, and you want to minimize the amount of graphics and amount of work. You want to be able to, and even better, you want to be able to teach the client how to use that actual application. Will the site generate long-term revenue or a service? Because if it's not generating revenue and it just looks nice, chances are they're going to probably want to replace it after a couple of years, because the client is highly graphical rather than revenue driven. Solution that produces revenue, people will be much more hesitant to replace quickly, because a bad user experience could lose you customers. Will you need a mobile app to interact with the site? Because if you do, you're going to probably need to integrate and can take into consideration integration technology. So these are just a couple of scenarios, and there are many other things to consider is SEO, search engine optimization, because if they want more customers coming to the site, you'll have to take that into consideration, because different browsers, search engines, will list the site differently based on how it's built out. Marketing, like, are they going to need marketing? Do they want you to do it? In that case, you might have to need a budget for ads and other marketing tools. Email lists, customer funnels, competition and business opportunities, your skill sets and job opportunities in the aftermath. So if you spend a lot of time building out the site, is it worth it? Or working on it? Because are your skill sets going to deteriorate because the market changes so fast? Or are they teaching you in demand skills that you'll be able to use later on? Because with smaller businesses, what happens is after it starts generating revenue, sometimes they'll hire a big team, and then after the site is built, they won't consider the need for support or anything, because they haven't experienced it, and something that's intangible, people tend to undervalue, like software. So what they'll do is they'll hire the big team, have you build it out and pay you something, and then they'll cut off the contracts and make some sort of excuse in order to downsize the team and maximize profits. So it's the logical thing to do. However, if your skill sets weren't developed from that experience, it makes it harder to get positions in the aftermath. So that's another thing to consider. And that's it. Those are some things to consider about building out a solution. I hope you gain something from it. It's my advice from having experienced a lot of these issues in the past. There is more, so I'll always keep learning and stuff like that. But that's all from for now. I hope you benefited from this, and leave a comment below if you have any extra advice for other people. Thank you and goodbye.